Imagine a world where the rules beliefs dictated your destiny. Your prayers, your church, even the books you owned. All of it could change overnight, not by choice, but by decree. For centuries, one dynasty, the Habsburgs, held sway over vast swaths of Europe, their power stretching from the sun-drenched plains of Spain to the icy peaks of the Austrian Alps. They shaped the lives of millions, their decisions echoing through time, often with a thunderous impact on people's souls and their very homes. They were kings and emperors deeply entwined with the spiritual pulse of their realms. Their story is a dramatic tapestry, woven with threads of faith, power, and the desperate struggle for survival. Get ready for a deep dive into the 7 pivotal religious policies that defined the Habsburg legacy, policies that left an indelible mark on history, one life story at a time. Number 7. The Patent of Toleration, issued by Joseph II. The year is 1781. In the heart of Vienna, Emperor Joseph II, a man known for his restless energy and his desire to modernize everything, put his signature to a document that would send ripples across his vast domains. For generations, the Habsburg lands had been a stronghold of Roman Catholicism. For centuries, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews had lived under various degrees of restriction, often facing harsh penalties for practicing their faith openly. They were second-class citizens, barred from public office, sometimes forbidden from building their own places of worship, or even required to use Catholic churches for certain ceremonies. Consider the story of a Lutheran family in a small village in Upper Austria. For generations they had secretly gathered in their homes, whispering prayers, reading from a hidden Bible. Their faith, a quiet flame passed down from parent to child. Their ancestors had seen relatives exiled, their books burned, their property confiscated by the agents of previous emperors. Their public life was a careful charade, attending Catholic services to avoid suspicion, their true beliefs locked deep within their hearts. They paid their taxes, served in the army, and contributed to their communities, yet they were always viewed with a lingering distrust. Then came the news, filtering through the taverns and markets, carried by merchants and travelers. The Emperor Joseph II had signed a new law. At first, many were skeptical. Had they not heard promises before, only to be disappointed? But this was different. The Patent of Toleration, as it was officially known, granted limited religious freedom to Lutherans, Calvinists, and Greek Orthodox Christians. They could now build churches, though without steeples or bells, and without direct access from public streets, so as not to offend Catholic sensibilities. Their ministers could preach, and their children could be educated in their own faith. They were allowed to hold private religious services without fear of arrest. A young man, perhaps the grandson of the quiet Lutheran farmer, stood on the village square when the official announcement was read. He heard the words, "Everyone will be allowed to practice his own religion, and no one will be forced to profess a religion he does not believe in." A tremor ran through him. It was not full equality, not by any means, but it was a crack in the wall, a ray of light. He saw the faces of his elders, etched with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The patent also addressed the situation of Jewish communities, though with different provisions. While it did not grant them the same level of religious freedom as the Christian denominations, it did significantly improve their civil rights. Jews were now allowed to attend public schools and universities, engage in more trades and professions, and live outside the designated Jewish quarters in some cities. They were no longer required to wear specific identifying marks or pay certain discriminatory taxes. This was a monumental change for a people who had long endured the weight of centuries-old prejudices and restrictions. A Jewish merchant in Prague, who had long navigated the labyrinthine regulations of his city, suddenly found new avenues opening for his children. His eldest son, who had dreamt of studying medicine, but was previously barred from university, could now pursue that path. His daughter, who was expected to marry young and stay within the traditional confines of the community, now had the possibility of learning skills that could make her economically independent. The Patent of Toleration, while not a declaration of full equality, chipped away at the systemic discrimination that had defined their lives for generations. It aimed to make them useful citizens, integrating them into the economic and social fabric of the empire, rather than keeping them as a separate, often persecuted class. The policy was driven by Joseph II's Enlightenment ideals. He saw religious uniformity as an outdated concept, a barrier to a productive and efficient state. He believed that if all his subjects, regardless of their creed, could contribute to the economic well-being of the empire, the state as a whole would prosper. He was a pragmatist, seeing the value in unlocking the potential of all his people. However, his reforms were not universally welcomed. Conservative elements within the Catholic Church, particularly the bishops and abbots, viewed the patent as a dangerous erosion of their traditional authority and the established order. They saw it as an attack on the very foundations of the state, which they believed rested on Catholic orthodoxy. Pamphlets were written, sermons were preached, and petitions were sent to the emperor urging him to reconsider. Despite the opposition Joseph II pressed ahead, he was an emperor who rarely listened to dissent. Once his mind was made up, the impact of the patent was immediate in some areas, gradual in others. In regions with significant Protestant populations like parts of Hungary or Bohemia, new albeit modest, churches began to appear. Ministers who had operated in secret now preached openly. Families who had concealed their faith for generations could finally worship without fear of discovery. It was a moment of cautious celebration for many. For the Habsburg dynasty, it marked a significant shift in their approach to religious diversity, a step, however small, towards a more modern secular understanding of governance. The old ways were slowly, painstakingly beginning to yield to a new vision for the empire. The very air, once thick with the fear of discovery for non-Catholics, seemed to lighten ever so slightly with the promise of a different future. This policy set a precedent indicating that the state could function effectively even without absolute religious conformity. It was a departure from centuries of aggressive recatholicization and a move towards a more pluralistic society, albeit one still deeply influenced by the predominant Catholic identity of the state. Number 6. Maria Theresa's strict regulations and taxation of Jewish communities. The mid-18th century, Empress Maria Theresa, a formidable woman who ruled with a firm hand, faced a complex challenge in her vast, diverse empire. While she was a devout Catholic and a staunch defender of the faith, her reign was also shaped by the pragmatic needs of a growing state. Her policies concerning Jewish communities reveal a contradictory blend of traditional prejudice and a surprising, almost reluctant, recognition of their economic value. The Jewish people, dispersed throughout the Habsburg lands, had historically faced intense discrimination, periodic expulsions, and severe restrictions on their lives and livelihoods. Consider the Jewish community in Prague. For centuries they had been confined to the Jewish quarter, a densely packed labyrinth of streets and synagogues, effectively a city within a city. Their lives were governed by a unique set of laws and regulations, often separate from their Christian neighbors. They were limited in the types of professions they could pursue, often restricted to moneylending, peddling, and various crafts that Christians found less desirable. They paid special taxes, often multiple times, simply for being Jewish. Life was precarious, always subject to the whims of the ruler or the eruption of popular prejudice. In 1744, during the War of the Austrian Succession, a wave of suspicions swept through the empire. Accusations of disloyalty were leveled against the Jewish community of Prague, alleging they had aided the Prussian enemy during the occupation of the city. Though evidence was scarce and disputed, Maria Theresa, under pressure from conservative factions, and perhaps swayed by her own deep-seated prejudices, issued a devastating decree. She ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Prague, and subsequently from all of Bohemia and Moravia. The news spread like wildfire through the Jewish quarter. Families who had lived in the city for generations, whose roots stretched back centuries, were given a mere matter of months to sell their homes, liquidate their businesses, and leave everything behind. Imagine the scene. Thousands of families, clutching what few possessions they could carry, trudging out of the city gates into the bitter cold of winter. Old men and women, young children, all forced into exile, their future uncertain, their community shattered. They sought refuge in neighboring German states or in parts of Hungary. Wherever a temporary haven could be found, the city of Prague, which had once buzzed with the vibrant life of its Jewish inhabitants, became eerily silent in its Jewish quarter. The synagogues empty, the shops shuttered. However, the economic impact of this mass expulsion was quickly felt. Prague's trade plummeted. Merchants who had relied on Jewish networks for credit and goods found their businesses faltering. The coffers of the state, which had collected significant taxes from the Jewish community, began to feel the pinch. The city council of Prague, along with many Bohemian nobles, began to petition the empress, highlighting the economic damage. They stressed the indispensable role Jewish merchants and financiers played in the economy of the kingdom. In 1748, just 4 years after the expulsion order, Maria Theresa, driven by pragmatism and the undeniable economic realities, reversed her decision. The Jews were allowed to return to Prague and the other Habsburg lands, but under even stricter conditions than before. The return was not a sign of newfound tolerance, but rather a calculated move to revive the economy and ensure a steady stream of tax revenue. The regulations imposed upon the returning Jewish communities were extensive and harsh. They were subjected to even heavier taxation, including a toleration tax for the privilege of simply residing in the empire, and a family tax that limited the number of Jewish families allowed in certain cities. The number of Jewish marriages was restricted, a direct attempt to control population growth. They were still confined to specific quarters. Their civil rights remained severely limited, and they were forbidden from owning land or holding public office. Maria Theresa also attempted to regulate their internal affairs, seeking to enforce a stricter, more orderly Jewish community under state supervision. She believed that by controlling their numbers and their economic activities, she could prevent them from corrupting Christian society while still extracting their economic utility. For a Jewish merchant who had returned to Prague after years of hardship, the relief of being home was tempered by the stifling weight of the new regulations. Every aspect of his life, from the size of his family to the goods he could trade, was now subject to direct state oversight and financial burdens. He saw his community rebuild slowly, carefully, but under the constant watchful eye of the imperial authorities. His children, while back in their ancestral home, still faced a future circumscribed by these restrictive decrees. Maria Theresa's policy toward the Jews was not one of persecution for its own sake, but rather one rooted in a desire for control and financial exploitation layered over existing religious prejudice. She viewed them as a necessary evil, valuable for their economic contributions, but simultaneously a distinct and potentially disruptive element that needed to be kept in check. Her reign saw the consolidation of imperial control over Jewish life, setting a precedent for state regulation that would only slowly begin to unravel in later decades. Her approach showed a shift from outright expulsion to systematic economic exploitation and strict social control, making them a source of revenue and a tool for the state, rather than simply an object of religious zealotry. Number 5. The expulsion of Protestants from Austria under Leopold I. The late 17th century was a time of immense pressure for the Habsburg dynasty. The Ottoman Turks were a constant threat to the east, and King Louis XIV of France loomed large to the west. Internally, the Habsburgs were still wrestling with the legacy of the Reformation. While Bohemia had been brutally re-Catholicized after the 30 Years' War, large pockets of Protestantism, particularly in Upper Austria, and parts of Inner Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, persisted, often in secret. Emperor Leopold I, a deeply pious and melancholic ruler, was determined to complete the work of his predecessors and forge a truly Catholic monarchy. Consider the plight of a Protestant farmer family living in the secluded valleys of the Salzkammergut region of Upper Austria. For generations their ancestors had clung to their Lutheran faith, often hiding their Bibles and holding secret services in remote forest clearings or hidden cellars. They had endured the missions of Jesuit preachers, the occasional visits of recatholization commissions that forced them to attend Catholic Mass, and the constant fear of informers. Despite the official decrees of the Counter-Reformation, the remote nature of their villages and the quiet stubbornness of the people had allowed Protestantism to survive. But by the 1680s, Leopold I's resolve hardened. He believed that religious unity was essential for the strength and stability of his empire, especially given the external threats. He saw Protestantism not just as a theological error, but as a source of potential disloyalty, a crack in the foundation of his state. His policy was clear: enforce the principle of quaes regio, eius religio, whose realm his religion, to its logical, brutal conclusion within his hereditary lands. There would be no more toleration. In 1684, the first edicts targeting the remaining Protestants in Upper Austria were issued. Special commissions, often accompanied by soldiers, descended upon the villages. People were interrogated, their homes searched for forbidden books, their children sometimes removed for Catholic re-education. The choice was stark: convert to Catholicism or face expulsion from the land. For families who had tilled the same soil for centuries, whose lives were intrinsically tied to their ancestral villages, this was a devastating ultimatum. Imagine the scene in a small village church, suddenly taken over by imperial agents. A stern official reads out the decree, his voice echoing in the rafters. The villagers, their faces pale, listen as they are told to renounce their faith or leave. Some, out of fear for their families, their homes, and their livelihoods, reluctantly agreed to convert, attending Catholic Mass, but many refused. They held firm to their beliefs, even if it meant abandoning everything they knew. Thousands of these Exalenten, as they became known, were forced to pack what meager belongings they could carry. They were often given only a short time to sell their property, typically at rock bottom prices to Catholic neighbors or agents of the nobility. Then, under escort, they began the arduous journey out of their homeland. Many sought refuge in Protestant regions of Germany, particularly Brandenburg, Prussia, where the rulers were eager to welcome skilled farmers and craftsmen to boost their own economies. The journey was fraught with peril. Some died of exposure or disease. Others arrived in foreign lands with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope of a new beginning. They carried with them not only their faith, but also their language, their traditions, and their stories of forced displacement. These expulsions were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic campaign that aimed to cleanse the hereditary Habsburg lands of non-Catholic elements. The goal was to create a unified, purely Catholic core for the empire, a bulwark against both Protestantism and Ottoman expansion. The policy was rigorously enforced for years, leading to a significant demographic and religious shift in many Austrian regions. While some Protestants remained practicing their faith in absolute secrecy, the visible and organized presence of Protestantism was largely extinguished. The beautiful rolling landscapes of Upper Austria became almost uniformly Catholic, a testament to Leopold I's unwavering commitment to his religious ideals. His actions, while perhaps seen as a triumph by the Catholic Church and Loyalists, resulted in untold human suffering and the forced migration of thousands, leaving a painful legacy for generations of the expelled. It demonstrated the lengths to which a Habsburg emperor would go to achieve a religious uniformity, prioritizing confessional purity over the welfare of a segment of his population. This was not merely about individual conversion. It was about the restructuring of entire societies. Number 4. The aggressive recatholicization of Bohemia under Ferdinand II. The early 17th century was a powder keg in Central Europe, and Bohemia, with its long history of religious dissent since the Hussite Wars, was the fuse. When Ferdinand II, a deeply devout and unyielding Catholic, ascended to the Bohemian throne in 1619, he inherited a kingdom simmering with Protestant unrest. For decades, under emperors like Rudolf II, Protestants in Bohemia had enjoyed considerable religious freedom, enshrined in the Letter of Majesty. Ferdinand, however, had no intention of honoring such concessions. He saw it as his divine mission to restore the Catholic faith to its rightful supremacy. The stage was set for confrontation. In May 1618, a group of angry Protestant noblemen, feeling their rights were being eroded, stormed Prague Castle and threw 2 imperial regents out of a high window. This act, the defenestration of Prague, ignited the Bohemian Revolt and subsequently the devastating 30 Years' War. Ferdinand II, who by then was also Holy Roman Emperor, saw this as an act of rebellion against both his authority and the true faith. The decisive moment came on November 8, 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain just outside Prague. The Bohemian Protestant forces were utterly crushed by the combined Imperial and Catholic League armies. It was a swift, overwhelming victory for Ferdinand II, and it opened the floodgates for a brutal and systematic re-Catholicization of Bohemia. Imagine the aftermath of the battle. Prague, once the vibrant center of Bohemian Protestantism, was gripped by fear. Soldiers, victorious and often ruthless, roamed the streets. The Protestant nobility who had dared to defy the emperor faced swift and terrible retribution. On June 21, 1621-27, leading Protestant nobles and burghers were executed in Old Town Square, their heads displayed on spikes above Charles Bridge. This blood court sent a chilling message to anyone who might still harbor thoughts of resistance. Following the executions, Ferdinand II initiated a comprehensive program to eradicate Protestantism from Bohemia. The first step was the confiscation of vast swaths of land from rebellious Protestant nobles. These lands, amounting to perhaps half of all noble estates in Bohemia, were then sold at bargain prices to Catholic loyalists, often foreigners who had supported the emperor. This created a new loyal Catholic aristocracy, fundamentally reshaping the social and economic landscape of the kingdom. A former Protestant lord who had owned sprawling estates and commanded hundreds of tenants found himself stripped of everything, his family left destitute, forced to flee the land he had known for generations. Then came the religious purge. Protestant ministers were expelled from the kingdom en masse. Their churches were closed down, often handed over to Catholic priests or the newly dominant Jesuit order. Jesuit missionaries, zealous and highly effective, poured into Bohemia, armed with imperial backing and a burning desire to convert. They preached, established schools, and sought to win back the hearts and minds of the populace. But persuasion was often accompanied by coercion. The official decrees were unyielding. In 1627, Ferdinand II issued the renewed Land Ordinance for Bohemia, which declared Catholicism the only permissible religion in the kingdom. All non-Catholics, regardless of their social standing, were given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism within a specified period, or leave the country, abandoning their property. This was not merely an edict. It was an active policy, enforced by the state. Imperial commissions, often accompanied by military escorts, toured the countryside, ensuring compliance. Protestant books were confiscated and burned in public squares, their very existence deemed heretical. Consider a scene in a Bohemian village. Imperial officials arrive demanding that all villagers attend Catholic Mass and swear an oath of allegiance to the Catholic faith. A village elder who had secretly kept a family Bible hidden for years watched in horror as soldiers ransacked homes, searching for any sign of Protestantism. Children were separated from their parents and sent to Catholic schools to be re-educated. Families were torn apart by the impossible choice between faith and homeland. Many, fearing for their lives and their families, outwardly converted, attending Catholic services while secretly maintaining their Protestant beliefs in the privacy of their homes. These were the stricto Protestants, living a double life, but thousands more, perhaps 150,000 people, chose exile. They left Bohemia in droves, forming significant Protestant communities in Saxony, Brandenburg, and other German states, carrying with them a deep sense of loss and grievance. The recatholicization of Bohemia under Ferdinand II was one of the most thorough and brutal religious policies in Habsburg history. It transformed Bohemia from a largely Protestant kingdom into a staunchly Catholic one, altering its demographic, social, and cultural fabric for centuries. The Protestant legacy, though suppressed, never entirely disappeared, but its open practice became a memory. The Habsburgs had succeeded in making Bohemia a loyal Catholic bulwark, but at an immense human cost, a cost that reverberated through the generations. The land was cleansed of overt dissent, but the scars of forced conversion and exile ran deep beneath the surface of the unified faith. Number 3. Rudolf II's Letter of Majesty for Bohemia. The early 17th century was a period of uneasy calm in the Habsburg Empire, particularly in Bohemia. The embers of the Reformation still glowed beneath the surface, especially in this kingdom, with its long history of religious independence. Emperor Rudolf II, a man known for his eccentricities, his passion for alchemy and astronomy, and his often reclusive nature, found himself caught between the fierce Catholic zeal of his family and the powerful Protestant nobility of Bohemia. For years, Bohemian Protestants, emboldened by their numbers and the legacy of the Hussite movement, had pressed for greater religious freedoms. They had been granted some concessions in the past, but these were always subject to interpretation and the changing whims of the ruler. As Rudolf II grew older and increasingly isolated in his Prague castle, his authority waned, and his younger brother, Matthias, began to challenge his rule. In 1609, under immense political pressure from the Bohemian estates, who leveraged the power struggle between Rudolf and Matthias, Rudolf II made a monumental concession. He signed the Letter of Majesty, a document that effectively granted unparalleled religious freedom to the Protestants of Bohemia. This was a radical departure from the general Habsburg policy of promoting Catholicism. Imagine the scene in Prague, the emperor's court buzzing with tension. Protestant nobles, dressed in their finest attire, stood firm, demanding their rights. Catholic hardliners, including members of the Habsburg family, urged Rudolf to resist. But Rudolf, perhaps seeing it as a way to secure the loyalty of the Bohemian estates against his brother, Matthias, relented. The Letter of Majesty was a carefully crafted document, born of political necessity rather than religious conviction on the part of the emperor. It stated that Bohemian Protestants, including both nobles and burghers, were free to practice their religion, to build churches, to establish their own schools, and to maintain their own confessional structure. It also stipulated that no one, including the emperor, could interfere with their religious practices. Even the royal domains were open for Protestant worship. A Protestant artisan in Prague who had long practiced his faith quietly, often attending clandestine services, heard the news with a mixture of disbelief and soaring hope. He had lived through years of uncertainty, never knowing if his family might be forced to convert or leave. Now the government had, in writing, affirmed his right to worship. He saw new Protestant churches begin to rise, modest at first, but a powerful symbol of their newfound freedom. Protestant schools previously operating in the shadows could now openly educate children in their faith. Ministers who had preached in secret could now do so in public. This was not a comprehensive edict of toleration as seen centuries later, but it was a groundbreaking acknowledgement of religious pluralism within a Habsburg domain. For a brief period, Bohemia became a beacon of religious freedom in a Europe often torn apart by confessional strife. Catholics and Protestants were for a time able to coexist, their rights ostensibly protected by imperial decree. The Letter of Majesty became the bedrock of Protestant rights in Bohemia, a cherished document that represented their struggle for religious autonomy. However, the period of relative calm proved fragile. The Letter of Majesty was a fragile compromise, signed by a weakened emperor under duress. Catholic factions, particularly those loyal to the ardently Catholic Ferdinand II, Rudolf's cousin and future emperor, resented the concessions and vowed to overturn them. They viewed the document not as a legitimate law, but as a dangerous erosion of Catholic supremacy and imperial authority. They interpreted its clauses narrowly, trying to find loopholes to restrict Protestant freedoms. The very existence of the Letter of Majesty became a source of escalating tension. Arguments over its interpretation and application quickly flared up, particularly concerning the construction of new Protestant churches on church lands. The Habsburg governors in Prague, acting on behalf of the Catholic Ferdinand, began to interfere with Protestant gatherings and building projects, openly disregarding the spirit of the letter. This disregard for the cherished document was a direct trigger for the defenestration of Prague in 1618, when Protestant nobles threw 2 Catholic imperial representatives from a window of Prague Castle. This act, born of a deep-seated grievance over the perceived violation of their religious rights, directly sparked the Bohemian Revolt and ignited the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. The Letter of Majesty, intended to secure peace, paradoxically became a flashpoint for war, touting how even attempts at religious freedom could spark violent conflict when underlying resentments festered. It was a brief, shining moment of religious liberty that ultimately crumbled under the weight of political ambition and confessional zeal. Number 2. The Religious Peace of Augsburg, negotiated by Ferdinand I. The mid-16th century was a tumultuous time across Europe. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther decades earlier, had fractured the religious unity of the Holy Roman Empire, leaving princes and populations divided. Emperor Charles V, a staunch Catholic and head of the vast Habsburg Empire, had spent much of his reign trying to suppress Protestantism by force. But he had largely failed. The religious wars had drained his resources and exhausted his patience. By 1555 he was ready to hand over the impossible task of governing the empire to his younger brother, Ferdinand I, who was already king of Bohemia and Hungary. Ferdinand I was a pragmatist. While personally a devout Catholic, he understood the futility of trying to force religious conformity on a deeply divided empire. He had seen the devastation of war and the entrenched positions of both Catholic and Lutheran princes. He knew that continued conflict threatened to tear the Holy Roman Empire apart completely. His approach was not driven by religious toleration as an ideal, but by the necessity of achieving a lasting peace, even if it meant grudgingly accepting the existence of Lutheranism. So, in September 1555, representatives of the various estates of the Holy Roman Empire, along with Ferdinand I acting on behalf of his brother Charles V, met in the city of Augsburg. The goal was to find a way for Catholics and Lutherans to coexist without perpetual warfare. The negotiations were long and arduous, marked by suspicion and distrust on both sides. Many radical Protestants and hardline Catholics were excluded from the talks, as the aim was to find a middle ground between the 2 major factions. The result was the Religious Peace of Augsburg, a landmark treaty that fundamentally reshaped the religious landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Its core principle was cuius regio, eius religio, which translates to whose realm, his religion. This meant that the religion of the ruler of each principality or free imperial city would determine the religion of its subjects. If the prince was Lutheran, his subjects would be Lutheran. If he was Catholic, his subjects would be Catholic. Imagine a Lutheran peasant living in a small village within a Catholic principality. Before the Peace of Augsburg, he might have faced persecution, forced conversion, or even exile. Now, with the new decree, he was given a choice: either convert to the prince's religion or move to a territory where his own faith was practiced. This was known as the ius emigrandi, the right to emigrate. While it offered an alternative to forced conversion, it was still a deeply disruptive choice for countless families who had lived on the same land for generations. A farmer might have to abandon his fields, his home, and his community to move to a neighboring territory simply because his prince had chosen a different faith. The Peace of Augsburg was a groundbreaking compromise, but it was far from perfect. It did not recognize any other Protestant denominations, such as Calvinism or Anabaptism, leaving them still outside the legal framework and subject to persecution. It also created an uneasy patchwork of religious territories across Germany. leading to future tensions and disputes over interpretation. The Ecclesiastical Reservation Clause, which stipulated that if an ecclesiastical prince, like a bishop or abbot, converted to Lutheranism, he would forfeit his territory, became a major point of contention in later years. For Ferdinand I, signing the Peace of Habsburg was a strategic necessity. It stabilized the empire and allowed him to focus on other pressing matters, like the ongoing threat from the Ottoman Empire. He had effectively created a framework for religious coexistence, even if it was a forced and imperfect one. While it did not end religious disputes, it provided a legal basis for a truce, preventing an immediate collapse into further widespread religious war within the empire for several decades. It acknowledged for the first time on such a grand scale that religious unity could no longer be imposed by force across the entire empire. This was a significant step away from the ideal of a monolithic Catholic Christendom, marking a grudging acceptance of religious pluralism within the vast lands under Habsburg influence. The Habsburgs, through Ferdinand I, had chosen stability over absolute conformity, a choice that shaped the future of Central Europe. Number 1, Charles V and the suppression of Protestantism in his Spanish and Netherlandish lands. The early 16th century saw the dramatic rise of the Habsburg dynasty, culminating in the reign of Charles V. He was arguably the most powerful monarch in Europe, inheriting a vast empire that stretched across Spain, its American colonies, the Netherlands, Austria. Charles V was also a deeply devout Catholic, born into an era where the idea of a unified Christian Europe, under the spiritual guidance of the Pope and the temporal leadership of the Emperor, was still a powerful ideal. When Martin Luther's 95 Theses sparked the Protestant Reformation in 1517, Charles V saw it not merely as a theological dispute but as a direct assault on the unity of Christendom and his imperial authority. His policy was clear and unwavering. Stamp out heresy wherever it appeared in his domains. Unlike in the Holy Roman Empire, where the political power of princes limited his ability to impose religious uniformity, in his hereditary lands of Spain and the Netherlands, Charles V wielded far greater direct authority. He deployed the full might of the state, including the formidable Spanish Inquisition, to enforce religious orthodoxy. Consider the atmosphere in Spain during Charles V's reign. The recent memory of the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to expel Muslim rulers, and the expulsion of the Jews in 1492 had forged a society intensely focused on religious purity. The Spanish Inquisition, initially established to ensure that Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity were truly sincere, became a powerful tool for rooting out Protestant ideas. Sermons thundered from pulpits against the new heresies emanating from Germany. Books advocating Lutheran ideas were seized and publicly burned in auto-da-fés. Spectacular public rituals meant to instill fear and reinforce faith. Imagine a scholar in Seville secretly reading a pamphlet outlining Luther's ideas on salvation by faith alone. He might have acquired it through clandestine trade routes from Northern Europe. One wrong word to a neighbor, one suspicious book discovered in his study, and his life could be shattered. The Inquisition's agents, often working on anonymous denunciations, were everywhere. Once arrested, the accused faced a secret trial, often without knowing their accusers, and endured tortures designed to extract confessions. Those found guilty could face imprisonment, confiscation of property, public humiliation, or, in the most severe cases, burning at the stake. The Netherlands, a wealthy and vibrant trading hub, presented a different challenge. Protestant ideas, particularly Calvinism, spread rapidly through its bustling cities and merchant communities. Charles V viewed this as an existential threat to his rule and the Catholic faith. He issued a series of increasingly harsh edicts, known as the Placards, aimed at suppressing Protestantism. These laws made it a capital offense to print, distribute, or possess heretical books, to attend Protestant services, or even to discuss prohibited religious doctrines. Informers were encouraged and severe penalties awaited anyone found harboring heretics. Think of a textile worker in Antwerp. his family having secretly embraced Calvinist teachings. They would gather in hidden rooms late at night to listen to forbidden sermons and share banned books. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face on the street sent a jolt of terror through them. Public executions of Protestants, often by burning or drowning, became a grim spectacle in towns across the Netherlands designed to terrorize the populace into conformity. For instance, in 1523, the first two Protestant martyrs in the Netherlands, Hendrik Vos and Jan van Ussen, were burned at the stake in Brussels under Charles V's authority. Their deaths were meant as a warning. Charles V's efforts to suppress Protestantism were relentless. He believed it was his sacred duty as emperor to protect the true faith and maintain the unity of his empire. He famously declared at the Diet of Worms in 1521 concerning Luther, "I am resolved to set my face against it. I shall devote my realms, my power, my friends, my body, my blood, my life, and my soul to this end." His actions in Spain and the Netherlands were a direct manifestation of this vow. He established new bishoprics, strengthened the Inquisition, and poured resources into counter-Reformation efforts. Despite his immense power and unwavering conviction, Charles V ultimately failed to eradicate Protestantism. In the Holy Roman Empire, the sheer scale of the movement and the resistance of princes forced him into the pragmatic compromise of the Peace of Augsburg, negotiated by his brother Ferdinand. In the Netherlands, his brutal suppression sowed the seeds of deep resentment and ultimately contributed to the 80 Years' War, a long and bloody struggle for independence that eventually led to the division of the Netherlands into a Protestant North and a Catholic South. Yet his policies underscore the depth of Habsburg commitment to Catholicism and the lengths to which they would go to preserve religious unity, setting a powerful precedent for future generators of Habsburg rulers and leaving a lasting mark on the religious character of Spain and parts of the Low Countries.